Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Selling Greenville, your favorite real estate podcast here in lovely Greenville, South Carolina. I am your host, as always, Stan McCune, realtor right here in Greenville, South Carolina, and you can find all of my contact information in the show notes, especially if you need a realtor in the Greenville area. That is really the way I make money. I don't really make a whole lot of money through this podcast, so that's the way you can best support me, is by using me as your realtor. So please, my contact information is in the show notes. And just a reminder, as always, please, the only other thing I ask of you guys is that you rate, review, subscribe, do all of those things with regard to the show, so you don't miss future episodes and so you support the show in that way. So I would greatly appreciate it if you guys could do that, just those two things. Now, I've been doing this in the middle of my shows, but today is the first day that we're going to introduce the official sponsor of Selling Greenville, Piper Insurance Group. Great insurance company that I use for my home and auto and umbrella insurance. They can help you with all three of those things. They're an independent insurance agency, so they can quote multiple different carriers to bring you back the best possible rate that they can find. They operate currently in 3 states, South Carolina, obviously, but also North Carolina and Georgia, and they can help you out with investment and commercial properties, fix and flips, rentals, ground up new construction, all of those good things. So please, their contact information is also in the show notes. Please reach out to Piper Insurance Group for a free quote today. Well, unfortunately, we are having to do a part 2, basically from last week's episode, because already things are changing and being a little bit chaotic with regard to the new compensation things that are happening in the world of real estate. And what happened literally the day that I released last week's podcast, got a little bit of a bomb dropped on me from my brokerage. Not a bad bomb, but just a surprise. It wasn't something that I was fully expecting. Was that C.Dan Joyner Realtors decided that we are going to completely decouple buyer agent compensation from listing agent or listing brokerage compensation. And I'm calling this the Great Decoupling. C.Dan Joyner is not the only company doing this. There are other companies doing this, and probably at some point this will become the standard for the industry. But in essence, there is not going to be any compensation for a buyer's agent ever coming directly from C.Dan Joyner as a listing brokerage. That doesn't mean buyer agent compensation is going away on our listings and on my listings, but it is just going to be handled a little bit differently, and that's what I'm going to explain in this episode a little bit more. And I'm going to try not to rehash things that we discussed in last episode as well. So some of this does change some of what I said in the pod last week, because like I said, it came as a bit of a surprise. But I'm with C.Dan Joyner. I'm going to abide by these policies, and I do think that they will benefit some sellers in the end. So here's the gist of it. We discussed last week that we can no longer offer, realtors can no longer offer MLS compensation, or on MLS, any compensation to a buyer's agent. You can still offer compensation to a buyer's agent, it just can't be on MLS. Well, as I've already said, C.Dan Joyner, my company, is no longer offering brokerage as a listing brokerage, offering compensation to a buyer's agent at all. It's going to have to come through the seller, is how this is going to work. Now, I don't speak for all C.Dan Joyner realtors on here. In other words, nothing I say on here should be taken as a statement from the company. And additionally, this is a rapidly evolving environment. So anything I say on here could very well change, and it could change very quickly. If it does, then I'll let you guys know that. So please keep that in mind. If you're listening to this in like 2027, things might be completely different than they are as I'm recording this in 2024. But for now, this is where things stand. And because I'm not speaking on behalf of the company, moving forward for the rest of this podcast, when I'm talking about listings, I'm not going to talk about listings with C.Dan Joyner. I'm going to talk about listings with me as a realtor. Otherwise, I could see this really getting confusing. Okay, so what does all this mean? It means that for listings with me, The only amount that a seller will be agreeing to pay from now on is the listing commission to me alone, with no consideration in writing. Very important caveat. No consideration in writing for compensating a buyer's agent. In other words, whatever amount is agreed upon to be paid to me as listing agent, none of it will be shared with the buyer's agent. Now, that's a big change, because in the past, my listing commission was split with a buyer's agent if there was a buyer's agent. That's no longer going to be the case, and as such, the listing commission for my listings will be lower than what they used to be in order to account for this, because sellers are still going to need potentially some extra money to still compensate a buyer's agent, albeit not through the listing brokerage compensation. So we talked about this before. The standard for 30-something years has been that the full commission paid by seller to the listing brokerage, that was it. There was never it was never that the seller was paying both the buyer's agent and the listing agent. What it was the seller was paying the listing agent, and then the listing agent was cutting off a split of their commission with a buyer's agent if there was one. And that just made sense. If the buyer's agent brought the buyer, then they deserved, roughly half of the commission. And in my case, different agents did it differently. In my case, I would always give half of my commission to the buyer's agent. Well, that is the core thing that's changing. Is it's no longer going to be that commission that kind of assumes that indirectly maybe assume that there might be a buyer's agent. Now it's just going to be a lower listing amount without any direct in writing compensation for a buyer's agent. That's what we have decoupled. We've decoupled the buyer's agent commission completely from the listing agent commission. Okay? Are you following? Hopefully you are. This is what the Department of Justice wanted. If you don't like the new system, take it up with the president and the DOJ. Now, I said last week that sellers should still consider compensating buyer's agents because most likely they will make more money in the long run doing that. I'm not going to rehash the logic behind that because you can still listen to my podcast from last week in order to get my thinking on that. So just go back and listen to that if you're curious. But nothing that I said with regard to seller strategy is changing. Sellers should still be willing to compensate a buyer's agent in order to make sure that you as a seller get top dollar for your home. This isn't to subsidize buyer's agents. This isn't to keep buyer agency alive. Nobody's trying to do that. Buyer agents provide a tremendous value. I've talked about this before in the show. Again, not going to rehash it. They provide a ton of value. Transactions go much smoother, generally speaking, when there's a competent buyer agent involved. And if they're not compensated, then they're not going to potentially be able to even show your home, because if the buyer can't afford to compensate their buyer agent, then why would they want to look at a home that's not offering any sort of buyer agent commission at all? And so I'm still encouraging my sellers, as I discussed last week, to be at least willing to offer some sort of concession that would cover all or some of a buyer agent. Are sellers forced to do that? No, they are not forced to do that. And so this is the big thing that's changing from what we talked about last week, is that from now on, sellers with me will not be locked in any way to compensating a buyer's agent. They were never locked into that, to be clear, but some may have felt that way. Now that it's decoupled, you can't even feel that way, and under no circumstances can you come to the conclusion that you are automatically paying for a buyer's agent. You should just be at least open to the possibility. So when a buyer makes an offer on one of my listings, they need to help, if they need help, paying for their buyer agent, because a buyer can still just pay for the buyer's agent. That's really the simplest option here, but a lot of buyers can't. And so when a buyer makes an offer and they do need help with paying for their buyer agents, they need to include a compensation agreement that specifies that the seller will be paying a whatever amount in order to compensate the buyer's agent. And so this is going to be just treated similarly to how closing costs are treated. If a buyer needs help from a seller with closing costs, they simply write that into the offer. And the seller can weigh the pros and cons of the offer, the pros and cons of paying closing costs, and then decide whether they want to accept, counter, or reject the offer. Now, some buyers, to sweeten the pot, will go up on the purchase price to offset what they are asking for the seller to pay in terms of closing costs. Or sometimes sellers will want to counter an offer so that the net amount ends up being the same as the list price after closing costs and concessions are accounted for. It all depends on how much leverage the buyer has and how much leverage the seller has, right? At the end of the day, if a home has been on the market for a long time, sellers are a lot more open to concessions. Whereas if a home has just come on the market, a seller might be like, you know what, I kind of want to wait and see what happens. And I'm not going to be forcing the sellers to offer concessions. We can't do that. It's up to sellers to make that call themselves. And this is just how buyer agent compensation is going to be. Sellers should simply think of it as a buyer asking for help with closing costs and not get hung up on where the money is going. Okay, I could see that being a completely separate issue where sellers are like, well, I'm willing to help a buyer with closing costs if they need closing costs, but I am not going to pay for their agent. You need to think of all this as the same. It's all a concession. Where the money goes, I mean, technically, the buyer can pay their buyer's agent and just ask for closing costs and just essentially use the closing costs to cover their the buyer agent commission that they're paying. It just makes it just adds a few line items on the settlement statement, but it's done exactly the same way, and you still wouldn't know as a seller where that money is going because it's just going towards the buyer's costs at closing. And they can apply that. I mean, essentially, it's not applied directly against any one expense. It's just the closing attorney just applies it against all the buyer's expenses minus obviously the down payment, and there are a handful of other expenses. But long story short, if you're a seller, please don't get hung up on the detail of if you're okay with concessions, but you're not okay with concessions being used towards a buyer's agent, I think that you're doing yourself a disservice, and I would recommend that you don't do that. But you as a seller will simply weigh as you get that offer and is asking for whatever compensation for a buyer's agent or closing cost help or whatever. You're just going to weigh that the same as you always have when a buyer has asked for concessions. If you're in a position where you want where it makes sense for you to pay for concessions, then you should do it. If you feel like you aren't ready to do that, you feel like you can get something better, and of course this is something me and my sellers will be discussing, then you need to consider things and strategize based on your confidence in being able to get something better. And then maybe you counter back, again, with a higher purchase price or something like that. But sellers won't have to accept compensation, but to accept that they will be paying compensation towards the buyer's agent, but they need to consider the pros and cons of it. Again, we talked about that in a lot more detail in the last episode that I recorded on here. Now, it's very possible that some buyers won't need much or any help on paying their agents. And in that case, this is a huge win for sellers, potentially thousands of dollars of cost savings. For buyer's agents, this could present some difficulty when the market turns back into a hot seller's market. Time will tell, but for now, I think buyer's agents are generally going to be able to find ways to get compensated without much drama because the market is slow enough right now. I'm not ready to say it's a buyer's market just yet, but it's slow enough that a lot of offers right now that I'm seeing are having seller concessions on them. And so that's just going to continue and possibly get more as we go along here. And again, this is the heart of what the Department of Justice wanted. They wanted sellers to no longer feel forced to compensate buyers' agents, even though they were never forced to compensate buyers' agents. The Department of Justice thought otherwise. And that is what I and my company are doing by decoupling the buyer agent commission from the listing commission and making it negotiable on every single contract. So that's the biggest thing that's changed since my last episode. But what am I actually seeing happening in the marketplace? I want to, share a little bit of what I've been seeing the past week. Well, for starters, a lot more communication between agents on this topic of compensation. I think I mentioned it last week, but I made an offer on a home where I had to ask the agent if they were offering compensation to a buyer's agent, and then the question was who is offering the compensation, right? Because this system that we have in place where the seller is compensating the buyer's agent directly versus the listing brokerage doing it, not every company is doing that. And this can actually be a big deal because, okay, so I said that I and my company are no longer compensating buyer's agents when we are the listing brokerage, but that not every company has made that decision at this time. Okay? From the standpoint of paperwork, this is a really important detail because the seller could functionally agree to pay double commissions if they agree to pay the buyer agent commission on top of paying their listing commission, which is also agreeing to compensate partially towards the buyer's agent. So let's say that you're a seller and you're going with a brokerage that is still offering buyer agent commissions as part of their listing agreement. Then you should not be double paying. You shouldn't be then agreeing to also have to pay the buyer agent directly. You could functionally be agreeing to pay a buyer's agent twice. Now, I'm oversimplifying things a little bit here, and almost certainly in the end, once the final numbers came out and whatnot, a buyer agent wouldn't end up being double paid, right? I think that this would get worked out, but I don't like to leave anything to chance when writing, submitting, or reviewing offers. And so this detail is an important detail. When you're a buyer's agent asking for compensation, you need to know, who do I need to ask the compensation of? Is it the listing brokerage or is it the seller? And so obviously that's a question I have had to answer. And on the listing side, I've had to ask that on the buyer side. And on the listing side, I've had similar conversations where I have had to answer that to buyer's agent. I just listed a home in Planters Row in Malden, which, by the way, is a great opportunity. It's a home that's being discounted by probably $30,000-$40,000 at least, simply on the basis of that there are tenants in there that have a lease that run through November of 2025. So if you're looking for a home with instant equity and you don't need to move in it right away, that could be a good opportunity for you. Just reach out and I will let you know. Planters Row is a really nice neighborhood of Malden. Okay. Anyway, because I just listed this house, I'm in the thick of experiencing these questions myself. And so usually the first question is your seller offering compensation to a buyer's agent? Well, I'm still perfecting my response, but essentially I'm telling them that a seller will consider it and will treat it like any other concession. So go ahead, send it in as part of the offer, and the seller will consider it. Not only have I done that, but I actually created a 3-minute YouTube video because I just know I'm going to get so many of these questions. And since I already have the studio and everything, I was just like, why not? I'm just going to create a video. It's not listed, so people, if you try to look for it, you're not going to find it. But I'm just going to send it. Anytime I get this question from listing agents, I'm just going to send them that video. Them listening to a 3-minute or watching a 3-minute video is going to be a lot less time than doing a gazillion back and forth text messages or emails. Now, what are some other things I've seen? I've seen some concern about steering, specifically from one brokerage that had its CEO make public statements about how they are not offering broker-to-broker compensation. I've seen some consternation that some agents aren't going to show homes that are listed by this one brokerage because of statements that their CEO made that were taken way out of context. As a reminder, steering is an illegal practice of buyer agents directing their clients away from certain properties that are either in areas that the realtors deem inferior to other areas or away from properties that would potentially result in the agent not making as much money as they want to make or that the buyer agreed to compensate them. Steering is illegal. Now, what is legal is if a buyer says, reach out to the listing agent and feel out whether they are willing to compensate you because I can't afford to compensate you as my buyer's agent. And if they say no, under no circumstances are we going to compensate, then I can't look at the house because I can't afford it. That's a separate conversation. The buyer made that decision, not the buyer's agent. But if a buyer's agent simply looks at all of the listings by a certain company that they don't think is going to compensate them, and then steers their buyer client away from those listings, that is illegal. That is not how this works. You need to still show homes to your buyer clients, and if you're an agent listening to this, you can't do that. You can't do that. You got to communicate the decision on what homes to look at or not look at is the buyer's decision, not the buyer agent's decision. You can't be the one making that decision for them. That is an illegal practice, very bad. So I'm hoping that we don't have that happening, because apparently, I don't think, I saw this chatter in vain. Apparently, this one brokerage, which is a national, very big brokerage, is having issues with messaging on how they're handling commissions, with the result that buyer's agents are actually threatening to not show homes that the company is listed. No, thank you. That is really, really bad. That needs to stop right away. And if agents don't clean this up, not only are we likely to see more lawsuits against the real estate industry, but almost certainly we will see more lawsuits against agents themselves, perhaps even from the Department of Justice. And this is, again, reinforces why sellers should at least be amenable, open to having a conversation about compensating buyers agents, because, again, there's going to be situations where buyers will choose to not look at a home. I'm not going to assume that buyer agents are going to steer, because, again, they could lose their license if they do that. But buyers themselves may very well do that. And there are some very real there's some very real potential that this could result in indirectly in steering from buyers themselves, right? Let's say that a buyer is looking at an area that's a lower income, lower socioeconomic status area, and in that area, the sellers simply cannot compensate buyers agents. That could result in buyers simply ignoring those areas. So unfortunately, the Department of Justice didn't think that far ahead on these things, but that's on them. That's not on us. We can only, as realtors, do the best that we can do. And you as sellers and buyers, you can only do the best that you can do with the hand that we've all been dealt. So there's a lot of confusion and consternation about all of this, but we will get through it. And to be honest, this change really probably happened at the best possible time, because had it happened when the market was on fire in 2021, it would have been absolute chaos. With the market being a bit slower, we have time to work out the kinks before rates drop and then things get crazy again. And I think for the time being, buyers likely won't have to directly pay their buyer agents for most transactions, since most sellers won't have the leverage to say no to concessions. I think most buyer agents will find a way to be able to shield their buyer clients from having to pay all or at least some of the buyer agent commissions, because we can bake it into the transaction as a seller concession. But let's not get it twisted. Sellers are for sure the big winners here, and reality is this won't result in the cost of housing going down in any meaningful way, but it will result in sellers potentially, in many cases, having fewer transaction costs than they would have had in the past. So, if you're a seller, you should be happy. You should be happy with the Great Decoupling, and you should list your house with me, because I am decoupling these listings and giving you an opportunity to potentially have more money in your pocket at the end of the day. Obviously, I guide my seller clients for every step of the process to ensure that they get top dollar, and particularly now as we're navigating all these different changes. So please contact me if you want to list your house as well. If you need a buyer agent, I do that as well. All of my contact information is in the show notes if you need me to help you with any of those things. Reminder to like, rate, review, subscribe to the show. And reminder as well, Piper Insurance Group. Contact them with all of your home, auto, and umbrella insurance needs. And we will talk again next time.